This is the third discourse in the small volume entitled God and the Individual. God is infinite. He is beyond the opposites of good and bad, right and wrong, virtue and vice, birth and death, pleasures and suffering. Such dual aspects do not belong to God. If we take God as one separate entity, he becomes one term in relational existence. Just as good is the counterpart of bad, God becomes the counterpart of not God, and the infinite comes to be looked upon as the opposite of the finite. When we talk of the infinite and the finite, we are referring to them as two, and the infinite has already become the second part of the duality. But the infinite belongs to the non-dual order of being. If the infinite is looked upon as the counterpart of the finite, it is strictly speaking no longer infinite, but a species of the finite, for it stands outside the finite as its opposite and is thus limited. Since the infinite cannot be the second part of the finite, the apparent existence of the finite is false. Here Baba sets out the very, very fundamental beginning of truth as we become used to it as he goes through the discourses. The infinite alone exists. God cannot be brought down to the domain of duality. There is only one being in reality, and it is the universal soul. The existence of the finite or the limited is only apparent or imaginary. You are infinite. You are really everywhere. But you think that you are the body and therefore consider yourself limited. If you think you are the body, which is sitting, you do not know your true nature. If you were to look within and experience your own soul in its true nature, you would realize that you are infinite and beyond all creation. But you identify yourself with the body. This false identification is due to ignorance, which makes itself effective through the medium of the mind. Ordinary man thinks that he is the physical body. A spiritually advanced man thinks that he is the subtle body. The saint thinks that he is the mind, but in none of them is the soul having direct self-knowledge. It is not a case of pure thinking unmixed with illusion. The soul, as soul, is infinite, aloof from mind or body. But owing to ignorance, the soul comes under the sway of the mind and becomes a thinker, sometimes identifying itself with the body and sometimes with the mind. From the limited point of view of a person who has not gone beyond the domain of Maya, there are numberless individuals. It seems that there are as many individuals as there are minds and bodies. In fact, there is only one universal soul, but the individual thinks that he is different from other individuals. One and the same soul is ultimately behind the minds of seemingly different individuals, and through them it has the multifarious experiences of duality. The one in the many comes to experience itself as one of the many. This is due to imagination or false thinking. Thinking becomes false owing to the interference of sanskaras accumulated during the process of the evolution of consciousness. The function of consciousness is perverted by the operation of sanskaras, which manifest themselves as desires. Through many lives, consciousness is continually being burdened by the after effects of experience. The perception of the soul is limited by these after effects. The thinking of the soul cannot break through the hedge created by sanskaras, and consciousness becomes a helpless captive of illusions projected by its own false thinking. This falsification of thought is present not only in cases where consciousness is partly developed, but also in man, where it is fully developed. The progressive evolution of consciousness, beginning with the stone stage, culminates in man. The history of evolution is the history of a gradual development of consciousness. The fruit of evolution is full consciousness, which is characteristic of man. But even this full consciousness is like a mirror covered by dust. Owing to the operation of samskaras, it does not yield clear and true knowledge of the nature of the soul. Though fully developed, it yields not truth, but imaginative construction, since its free functioning is hindered by the weight of the samskaras. Moreover, it cannot extend beyond the cage created by its desires, and therefore is limited in its scope. The boundary in which consciousness can move is prescribed by the samskaras, and the functioning of consciousness is also determined by the desires. As desires aim at self-satisfaction, the whole consciousness becomes self-centered and individualized. The individualization of consciousness may in a sense be said to be the effect of the vortex of desires. The soul gets enmeshed in the desires and cannot step out of the circumscribed individuality constituted by these desires. It imagines these barriers and becomes self-hypnotized. It looks upon itself as being limited and separate from other individuals. It gets entangled in individualistic existence and imagines a world of manifold separateness composed of many individuals with their respective minds and bodies. When the rays of the sun are made to pass through a prism, they get dispersed and become separate owing to refraction. If each of these rays had consciousness, it would consider itself as being separate from the other rays, forgetting entirely that its source, and on the other side of the prism, it had no separate existence. In the same way, the one being descends into the domain of Maya and assumes a multiplicity which does not in fact exist. The separateness of individuals does not exist in reality, but only in imagination. The one universal soul imagines separateness in itself, and out of this division there arises the thought of I and mine, as opposed to you and yours. Although the soul is in reality an undivided and absolute unity, it appears as being manifold and divided owing to the working of its own imagination. Imagination is not a reality. Even in its highest flight, it is a departure from truth. It is anything but the truth. The experience which the soul gathers in terms of the individualized ego is all imagination. It is a misapprehension of the soul. Out of the imagination of the universal soul are born many individuals. This is Maya, or ignorance. Side by side with the birth of the separate and limited individuality, there also comes into existence the objective universe. As the limited individuality has separate existence, not in fact, but only in imagination, the objective universe also has no independent and separate reality. It is the one universal self appearing in the second role of manifestation through the attributes. When the soul descends into the domain of Maya, it takes upon itself the limitations of manifold existence. This self-limitation of the soul might be looked upon as its self-sacrifice on the altar of consciousness. Although it eternally remains the same infinite absolute, it suffers a kind of timeless contraction through its apparent descent into the world of time, variety, and evolution. What really evolves, however, is not the soul itself, but only the consciousness which, owing to its limitations, gives rise to the limited individuality. The history of the limited individuality is a history of the development of a triple entanglement with mind, energy, and matter, that is, the body. Duality prevails in all these domains, and the soul gets entangled therein, although it is, in essence, beyond duality. Duality implies the existence of opposites limiting and balancing each other through mutual tension. Good and bad, virtue and vice, are examples of such opposites. The ignorant soul enmeshed in duality is in the clutches of both good and bad. The duality of good and bad arises due to ignorance, but once entangled with it, the soul comes under its sway. During the evolution of the triple entanglement with matter, that is body, energy, and mind, the ignorant soul is continually in the grip of wanting. It wants the good and bad of the gross world. It wants the good and bad of the subtle world, and it wants the good and bad of the mental world. And owing to the distinction of good and bad, wanting itself becomes good and bad. Wanting thus comes to be inevitably limited by the perpetual tension of the opposites. This gives rise to unending oscillation from one state to another without arriving at the unlimited state, which can only be discovered in the unchanging, eternal aspect of life. The infinite is to be sought beyond the domain of duality. This becomes possible only when consciousness can emerge from the limited individuality by breaking through the barriers of samskaras. We have seen that the possible field of consciousness is limited by the samskaras. This limitation creates a division of the human psyche into two parts. One part falls within the range of consciousness, and the other part falls beyond it. The unconscious part, in its full extent, is identical with the power which is behind matter. It is referred to as God by the Orthodox religions. The ultimate reality, which is symbolically represented through such concepts, can be known fully only by bringing the unconscious into consciousness. An extension of consciousness consists in being conscious of that which was formerly a part of the unconscious. The progressive conquest of the unconscious by the conscious culminates in consummate consciousness, which is unlimited in scope and unhindered in function. Between this highest state of consciousness and the limited, though full, consciousness of average humanity, there are about 49 degrees of illumined consciousness. They mark the important stages of growing illumination. The gulf between the clouded consciousness of average humanity and the fully illumined consciousness of a perfect master is created by samskaras, which give rise to egoism. These can be removed through perfect character, devotion, and selfless service, but the best results in this direction are attained through the help of a perfect master. Spiritual advancement consists not in the further development of consciousness, for it is already fully developed in man, but in the emancipation of consciousness from the bondage of samskaras. Although in essence consciousness is the same in all the different states of existence, it can never be consummate unless it can reflect the knowledge of infinity without the least shadow of ignorance, and also cover the whole extent of creation, illumining the different spheres of existence. Every time you go to sleep, you are unconsciously united with the infinite reality. This unification involves the extension of unconsciousness over consciousness. It thus bridges over the chasm between the unconscious and the conscious. But being unconscious of this union, you do not consciously derive any benefit from it. This is the reason why, when you wake up again from deep sleep, you become aware of the selfsame humdrum individual, and you begin to act and experience exactly as you acted and experienced before going to sleep. If your union with the Supreme Reality had been a conscious union, you would have awakened into a completely new and infinitely rich life. A perfect master is consciously united with the infinite reality. In his case, the chasm between consciousness and unconsciousness is bridged, not by the extension of the unconscious over the conscious, as in the man who enjoys deep sleep, but by the extension of consciousness over unconsciousness. The waxing and waning of consciousness is applicable only to the limited individual. In the case of the perfect master, the conquest of the unconscious by the conscious is final and permanent, and therefore his state of self-knowledge is continuous and unbroken and remains the same at all times without any diminution. From this you can see that the perfect master never sleeps in the ordinary sense of the word. When he rests his body, he experiences no gap in his consciousness. In the state of perfection, full consciousness becomes consummate by the disappearance of all obstacles to illumination. The conquest of the unconscious by the conscious is complete, and the person continuously dwells in the full blaze of illumination, or as one with illumination. He becomes illumination itself. As long as a person remains under the sway of duality and looks upon manifold experience as being true and final, he has not traversed the domain of ignorance. In the state of final understanding, a person realizes that the infinite, which is one without a second, is the only reality. The infinite pervades and includes all existence, leaving nothing as its rival. A person who has such realization has attained the highest state of consciousness. In this state, the full consciousness, which is the fruit of evolution, is retained, but the limitations of sanskaras and desires are completely transcended. The limited individuality, which is the creation of ignorance, is transformed into the divine individuality, which is unlimited. The illimitable consciousness of the universal soul becomes individualized in this focus without giving rise to any form of illusion. The person is free from all self-centered desires, and he becomes the medium of the spontaneous flow of the supreme and universal will, which expresses divinity. Individuality becomes limitless by the disappearance of ignorance. As it is unimpaired by the separateness of Maya and unentangled in its duality, it enjoys the state of liberation in which there is objectless awareness, pure being, and unclouded joy. Such a person has no longer any illusions which perplex and bewilder man. In one sense, he is dead. The personal ego, which is the source of the sense of separateness, has been forever annihilated. But in another sense, he is alive forevermore with unconquerable love and eternal bliss. He has infinite power and wisdom, and the whole universe is to him a field for his spiritual work of perfecting mankind.